Okay. We're on. Hello, world. Okay, so thank you for coming out tonight. And it's a little frustrating because things went really smoothly last week, but this is the way it goes. So next slide. This all began for me in 2018. Now, I will admit to you, before I knew this stuff, there's a lot of other people who knew some things that were going on. And I want to preface all of this by saying that this is not easy information to digest. It's kind of painful to listen to watch, and to see what's going on. Because the question will come to your head, well, why is God letting this happen? Right? Why is all of this bad stuff happening, and why is this coming against us in such a powerful way? Well, it's just the way it is, and we have to accept divine providence, right? And that is, we believe that Jesus came into this world, he walked this earth, he suffered, and he died for our sake. So bad things happened to Jesus, and bad things happened to different peoples in different ages. We in our great country have had so many years of blessing, and abundance, and freedoms, and so forth. But the Lord is also, as you'll be seeing, Our Lady has been challenging us really for over a century, long before even Fatima. She has been challenging us to live the faith, to be converted by the gospel, but a great many people on the planet and in our country and in our world, are just not doing that. Okay, so we heard in 2018 in the summer of Cardinal McCarrick's very bad deeds, right? And so that kind of set off a whole bunch of things, and he was the highest ranking cardinal to have been, have to resign for bad actions. And so next slide. That happened as he was the highest ranking cardinal to ever resign then, having been accused. Of course, he didn't really claim any kind of responsibility, but that is what happened. Next slide. And then around the same time, former Father Richard Sipe, he became a psychologist. He left the ministry, and he wrote a lot about sexual abuse. And he articles said that he actually had written, he had been writing about this and trying to help the bishops. Next slide. And he wrote a letter back in 1985, spoke to the conference of bishops in 1986, and he might have done so again in the 2000s after the 2002 long Lent, right? But nothing seemed to have been done about it. Next slide. And then later in that summer, in August, towards the end of August, the Pope was finishing up the World Meeting of Families in Ireland, and as he was coming home, a testimony surfaced by the formal Apostolic Nuncio to the United States of America, Archbishop Cardinal Carlo Maria Vigano. And in Vigano's letter, he said, people knew this all the way up to the top. And in fact, the Holy Father talked to me directly, and he asked me about what I thought about Cardinal McCarrick. And I said to him, there's a dossier this thick about Cardinal McCarrick. Still nothing had been done. And that would have been about 2013 or so when the Pope was elected. Next slide. So, back up a little. Back up. There. And so there was contestation about did the Pope really know anything, and was Cardinal McCarrick was supposedly suppressed for a period of time, and he was not supposed to go out and do public things. And then there were people saying, see, here's a video of him doing this, and here's a video of him doing that. And so things were going back and forth, and people were speaking about the fact that if you want to say that he was suppressed by Pope Benedict XVI, well, we have video testimony that he was out and about engaging in public things. But it's also very clear that he had been doing a number of trips and things like this before Pope Benedict, but during the reign of Pope Benedict, he clearly was not doing all the activity that he used to have done. So there were things going back and forth, and then another letter came out, and it said, it was by a priest in the United States who said he had notified the Vatican. Basically, he was supporting what Vigano had said, and he had notified the Vatican as early as the year 2000, and he actually eventually, it took a little while, but he eventually then surfaced for the media a letter of reception from Rome saying that we have received your, and this priest had worked in the Archdiocese of Newark, New Jersey, and so he knew firsthand of certain accounts, and that's where at one point McCarrick had been the Archbishop, and so he knew of the certain accounts, and then he produced this letter saying, here, I have indeed received a letter from the Vatican acknowledging what I wrote to them about, and saying that there are many accusations of inappropriate behavior on behalf of, or by Cardinal McCarrick. Next slide. So with all that as a background, again, this slide is out of place. Why? All right, let's keep going. We're going to jump back to 1969 for a second. All right, so this is a radio address by then Father Joseph Ratzinger. So they were just on the heels of the Second Vatican Council. There's a lot of excitement among certain segments of the people saying, oh, we're going to be able to work with our Protestant brothers and sisters again. You know, we're going to have the Mass in English. Things are going to be different. Things are going to, there's a lot of enthusiasm. But yet, for some reason, he put out this radio address. It got produced and published in 2007 or so. But this was an address he'd given way back in that time. Next slide. From the crisis of today, the Church of tomorrow will emerge. Next slide. She will become small and will have to start afresh, more or less from the beginning. And next. She will no longer be able to inhabit many of the edifices she built in prosperity. As the number of her adherents diminishes, so it will lose many of her social privileges. Okay, so what you see there is, with all of that bad behavior on the part of our priests and a cardinal and the bishops covering up things and all that kind of stuff, we began to lose our social privileges. But even before that, of course, there was a diminishment of participation in the life of the church. All right? Going back to 1976, next slide. This is an article that appeared in the... and it was called the New York City News. The New York Times was on strike at this time, I guess, and so this little article appeared in this little newspaper that was being produced. And this is this was Cardinal Voitiwa, right? So he was just then the Archbishop of Krakow, I think at the time, and so he had come over just a couple of years before he was elected Pope, as Pope John Paul II, right? And let me see the next slide, I think. No, go back, please. So we are now standing in the greatest historical confrontation humanity has gone through. I do not think that wide circles of the American society or wide circles of the Christian community realize this fully. We are now facing the final confrontation between the church and the anti-church, of the gospel versus the anti-gospel. This confrontation lies within the plans of divine providence. It is a trial which the whole church, and the Polish church in particular, must take up. It is a trial of not only our nation and the church, but in a sense a test of 2,000 years of culture and Christian civilization, with all of its consequences for human dignity, individual rights, human rights, and the rights of nations. That's a lot. That's pretty powerful. I think we come back to this, this speech a little bit later on. Next. So as that summer wore on and we started moving into the fall, bishops started going back and forth. Some bishops were saying, well, we should be investigating this. How is it that a priest could become a bishop, become a cardinal, and move all the way up the ladder? He was not made a cardinal until 2002, which is 2 years after that letter arrived at the Vatican, remember? And they were wondering, how could all of this have happened? So the bishops start having contestations of, should we investigate? No, we shouldn't investigate, all that kind of thing. And so things got testy there for a little while. Next slide. Even Cardinal Ouellet responds to Archbishop Vigano, and all of this began to stir in my mind some kind of memory. Next slide. And I heard something about this. This was jogging my memory. Keep going. And I thought this was maybe some kind of Marian apparition. Keep going. Was it Medjugorje? Was it locutions given to Father Stefano Gobi by Our Lady? Was it Fatima? It was none of these things. And I kept trying to figure it out. Keep going. Because I'd heard bishops would fight bishops and cardinals would oppose cardinals. Next. I finally figured it out, and that was the Akita, Japan apparitions. Next. And this was from 1973 to 81. Sister Agnes Sasegawa was a convert to the Catholic faith, and she experienced these. She experienced some miracles. First, as she had gone deaf, and then as Our Lady, I can't remember all the details, but as Our Lady appeared to her, she recovered her hearing and so forth. So she had these apparitions. And Mary said to her, "As I told you, if men do not repent and better themselves, the Father will inflict a terrible punishment on all humanity. The work of the devil will infiltrate even into the church in such a way that one will see cardinals opposing cardinals and bishops against other bishops. The priests who venerate me will be scorned and opposed by their confreres. The church and altars will be vandalized. The church will be full of those who accept compromises, and the demon will press many priests and consecrated souls to leave the service of the Lord. The demon will rage especially against souls consecrated to God. The thought of the loss of so many souls is the cause of my sadness. If sins increase in number and gravity, there will no longer be pardon for them. Each day recite the prayers of the Rosary. With the Rosary, pray for the Pope, the bishops, and the priests." So when I pray the Rosary, what I like to do is on that first Our Father bead, I want to remember the Pope, the bishops, and the priests in my Rosary, as I use that as my reminder. So this particular message came to Sister Agnes on a very particular day, October 13, 1973. If you know anything about Fatima, you know that's exactly 66 years to the day of the event of the Miracle of the Sun at Fatima. It was the last apparition in Fatima that year, and the great Miracle of the Sun, as we'll get into in a few minutes in the details. The bishop of Akita, Joseph Ito, said that the message is basically a repetition of the message of Fatima. All right, so that was the bishop. He had to approve it. About 5 years later, he did his due diligence. He investigated. And one of the slides, you don't see it here. This is a replica image that's up there of the Lady of All Nations, which was another church-approved apparition in Amsterdam. A laywoman named Ida Peerdman. And she had visions that went from something like 1945 into the late 50s, or maybe a little bit later. As an example of bishops against other bishops, watch this utterly humiliating treatment of the German bishops towards Pope Benedict XVI on his visit to his homeland in Germany. This is a Polish piece. You don't need any sound or anything. You'll see everything you need to see as this plays out. So here he comes. Now this is Cardinal Bertone. It's his Secretary of State, so he's one of his entourage. But he comes here. He gets a shake by the first guy, a shake by the second guy, and this is, I don't know, a chancellor or something. Maybe it's the mayor of the city he's in. So all these guys skip. They don't give him his hand, right? That none of them. This guy gets a little gesture. Another guy, no handshake. Another guy, no handshake. Get a little bow anyway. He holds out his hand, one after the other, skip giving him his hand. Right? There's a couple of guys who shake his hand, and the last few I'll skip. Maybe another day. Right? Just very humiliating, very unchristian, very disrespectful. But you just see the kind of a spirit that's in the church, right? So very unpleasant, very unpleasant. In his inaugural homily of Sunday, April 24th, 2005, Pope Benedict XVI made this request to the faithful in the church. Pray for me that I may not flee for fear of the wolves. All right? Did we know what he's talking about? We really don't know exactly, but perhaps only after his death. The fact that he was the first pope to resign in centuries certainly says something to us and of the opposition he felt from within the church. Having learned of all these things so far, I began to look a little deeper into the apparitions of Fatima. So what we can understand is there's either three secrets, or you say it's one secret in three parts, whichever way you want to look at it. The first part has a vision of hell that shakes the kids to the core as they look on. And this was then followed by an explanation by Our Lady of what they saw and its significance. Right? The second part's a description about World War I ending, but saying that a worse war will come about if the people do not convert. And so here she then offers remedies, and it's particularly she says, God wishes to establish in the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart. She said that she would return to ask for the consecration of Russia. So she did not ask for that consecration in that same year. Okay? The first part of the secret is a vision of hell. She opened her hands once more. She had already done this before, as she had done the 2 previous months. The rays of light appeared to penetrate the earth, and as we saw, it was as it were a vast sea of fire. Plunged in this fire, we saw the demons and the souls of the damned. The latter were like transparent burning embers, all blackened or burnished bronze, having human forms. They were floating about in that conflagration, now raised into the air by the flames which issued from within themselves, together with great clouds of smoke. The demons were distinguished from the souls of the damned by their terrifying and repellent likeness to frightful and unknown animals, black and transparent like burning coals. That vision lasted only a moment, thanks to our good Mother of Heaven. The Virgin said sadly, "You have seen hell, where the souls of poor sinners go. To save them, God wishes to establish in the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart." Right? And that's why I've been emphasizing that, like we were doing the 33 days to morning glory and those sorts of devotions. And I wanted to consecrate the whole parish, the 2 parishes, to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, which is what I did in my last parish as well. As that consecration is very important to give us protection. If what I say to you is done, many souls will be saved and there will be peace. The war is going to end, but if people do not cease offending God, a worse one will break out during the reign of Pius XI. When you see a light and illumined by an unknown light, know that this is the great sign given you by God that he is about to punish the world for its crimes by means of war, famine, and persecutions of the Church and of the Holy Father. I have to say that, I grew up in the same era most of you did, right? And we grew up with a sense and understanding that, God doesn't punish, right? We just, that's kind of an old thing and all this. Well, this kind of statement, these sort of statements are very strong and kind of great against our ears in the modern era. I even had a very holy spiritual director. I loved the guy, God rest his soul, and really cherished him. I had him as my spiritual director for all 5 years I was in the seminary. But I can still tell you, rings out in my ears. One day we were talking, and he said, God does not punish, And so this was the notion that we had in the church and in the world, in our families. God doesn't punish. To prevent this, I shall come to ask for the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart and the communion of reparation on the first Saturdays. If my requests are heeded, Russia will be converted and there will be peace. If not, she will spread her errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions of the church. Okay, she keeps going. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer. Various nations will be annihilated. In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. the Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and she will be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world. All right, so there's a hopeful message in all that. It's like even if the bad stuff comes, even if there isn't conversion, even if Russia is not converted right away, she hints at it by saying it will happen late, and there is hope. There will be an era of peace. This little passage appeared later on. It was not in her original writings to the bishop when he asked her to write some things down. It was in her third memoir. This gets into the weeds. We won't go this far into it. But in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, comma, etc. Okay, that's an interesting thing. Do you think that the Blessed Virgin Mary said etc.? Probably not. So Sister Lucia is hiding something in there, and this is where we get into the controversy about, the third secret of Fatima and all that kind of stuff. We're not going to go into that now, but do not tell this to anybody. Francisco, yes, you may tell him. Note, Francisco, yes, you may tell him. This is interesting. Why? Lucia could see, hear, and speak to the Blessed Virgin Mary, right? Jacinta could see and hear, but not speak. Francisco could only see her and the visions. He could not hear or speak to her. Just little interesting details about the experience. So what are the details from all of this? Hell is real, and many go there. There is a remedy, devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. If warnings are not heeded and people don't convert, a worse war then World War I will come. Was World War I bad? Yeah, very bad, right? And was World War II worse? Very much worse, right? Many millions died in the first, and even more millions died in the second. Consecration of Russia is a necessity. She will return to ask for that. If there isn't a consecration, then there will be a sign of another war, and communism will spread. As I say, Russia will spread its errors, or communism will spread. That's the presumed intention of what she's saying there. Another thing she did is in that vision, she promised that there would be a sign in October. The little kids the shepherd children are asking for miracles, right? This is the third vision, and they're saying, people are asking for her to prove herself, right? And so she promises that in October she would give a miraculous sign. So that happens on October 13, 1917, and this is widely known as the Miracle of the Sun. There were ranging from 50,000 to 100,000. Most of us, we just sort of settle on the number 70,000 people present and witness. Now, the psychologists and things will say, well, there was mass hallucination, people, got stirred into a frenzy or something like that. But the witnesses to this event actually go out as far as 20 miles away. So people standing around in their villages were looking up and seeing all kinds of things happening in the skies. The streets were like a kind of a kaleidoscope. In some places, the street stones were like flashing like a kaleidoscope type of light all around the streets and on the sides of the buildings and stuff like this. Various phenomenon that people in all kinds of different areas around there. An interesting little side bit of all that is, at one point, Mary said that that miracle would have actually been greater except for something that happened in August, in which the kids were kidnapped, basically, and the August 13th apparition never actually happened on August 13th. I think it was like 6 days later. And that the kids were kidnapped by the local mayor, and they were Freemasons and communists who were in control of Portugal at this time. And they went and they threatened them, threw them in jail overnight and stuff like this. And the kids never spoke about the secrets or anything like that. So these are images. That first image was O Secolo. You saw that's the newspaper, right? So this is a couple days after the event, and the newspaper, the Times, basically the Age or the Times, shows this imagery of the people looking up into the sky there in the fields that they call it the Cova de Iria. and the Miracle of Fatima. And so you see, this is a historical event, you know. If you believe in the Civil War or whatever, then you should believe in this. It's something that's happened. Again, the owners of these newspapers and stuff were Freemasons and communists. They were not friends of the church at all. They were showing, but they wrote the story and told the story just as it happened. Right? They did not slant it in any way. So, coming up to this sign, I'm going to take a break and have a little water just a second. Okay, keep going, Chris. So, when you see a light illumined by an unknown light, know that this is the great sign given to you by God, that he is about to punish the world for its crimes by means of war, famine, and persecutions of the church and of the Holy Father. So, this happened on January 25, 1938. After much study, scientists agreed this did not fit the pattern of an aurora borealis, which is preceded by considerable sunspot activity. Here there was only a single sunspot noticed the weekend before. Unlike the aurora borealis, clearest in the Arctic regions, this display was seen most vividly over an incredible area as far south as Spain, Portugal, and Bermuda. Moreover, while most auroras reach a height of 186 miles, some of the rays of this phenomenon reached the fantastic height of 434 miles into the sky. So war as we know it did not break out in that year, but the following year, right? If you want to say the start of the World War II was what? 1st of September, 1939, when Poland was invaded, right? However, about a week after this event, Hitler abolishes the war ministry and creates a high command of the armed forces, giving him direct control of the German military. And then, in March of that year, he annexes Austria, all right? So as he takes over Austria, that's fairly, you know, there's kind of, as one commentator says, there's often rolling starts to wars, right? So maybe military conflict didn't happen for another year, but already aggression was happening. And as I said, September 1, 1939, Germany invades Poland. If my requests are heeded, she said, Russia will be converted and there will be peace. If not, she will spread her errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions of the church. All right, so we go back to this quotation from Cardinal Voitiwa, 1976. We are now facing the final confrontation between the church and the anti-church, of the gospel versus the anti-gospel. All right, next slide. This confrontation lies within the plans of divine providence. It is a trial which the whole church, and the Polish church in particular, must take up, right? Now, so already you had Poland invaded by Nazi Germany in 1939, and here he is saying in 1976, again, that there's going to be some role that Poland is going to have to play in this confrontation, right? So it is a trial not only of our nation and the church, but in a sense, a test of 2,000 years of culture and Christian civilization. So he literally sees a culture clash coming against, what we once called Christendom, right? Remember, in the Middle Ages, you called that whole bulk of Europe Christendom. It was a united body of faith. And you had the Holy Roman Empire and all of this. He goes on, all of its consequences for human dignity, individual rights, human rights, and the rights of nations. Do you feel as if there's certain rights that are being impinged upon right now? Human rights, rights of nations. There's an awful lot that's going around that makes you feel like this 1976 speech was right on the money. So what was he talking about? Was it the fall of the Soviet Union? Remember, we're in the middle of the Cold War at this time. Would the disintegration of the USSR constitute this final confrontation and satisfy the third secret of Fatima, or the part of, well, actually that's a misnomer what I put there, really, the second part of the secret. So we're going to lead up to that. We look at May 13th, 1981. All right, so you have, again, an anniversary of Fatima here. This would be, what, 8 years after the vision, the apparition of Mary in Akita, on May 13th, not October 13th, but May 13, 1981. So that's the anniversary of the first apparition of Fatima in 1917. Pope John Paul II is shot in St. Peter's Square. The bullet miraculously changed course inside his body, and it just barely, by they say by like a centimeter or something, missed a major artery. He would have bled out in no time if it had hit him. He said, "One hand pulled the trigger, but another hand, Mary's, guided the bullet." And so he realized a little bit later on that it was the anniversary of Fatima when that happened. In the hospital, he asked to see the third secret of Fatima. And then the next year, he makes a visit to Fatima. He places a bullet, or a portion thereof, in the crown of the statue of Fatima that was recovered from the site in St. Peter's Square, the bullet was. And then he makes a consecration of the world to the Immaculate Heart. Okay? However, this is not according to the formula that was asked for by Our Lady. Once again, a couple years later, March 25, or May 25th, that's wrong, it's supposed to be March 25th, oh my goodness, which is the Feast of the Annunciation, right, of Gabriel to Mary. Once again, seeking to fulfill the desires of the Blessed Virgin Mary at Fatima, he makes a consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Now this time he does fulfill another portion. So there had been several consecrations by different popes, but none of them were with all of the bishops of the world. And that was one of the things that was being done at this time. But he doesn't specifically say Russia. He makes a consecration to the world, and he ad-libs in the middle of it and says, "And for those who are awaiting our consecration," but without specifying Russia. So to this day, there is controversy about whether this was accepted by heaven. I'm not going to go into all of that. Again, there were different popes made different kinds of consecrations, but this was the closest one to what Our Lady asked for. What about, is there evidence to say it's clear that it was accepted? Has Russia been converted? And that would mean converted to the Catholic faith, right? That has not happened yet. Is there peace on earth? Yes? No? No, there's not peace on earth, right? In fact, there's ever-increasing tensions in certain parts of the world that should make us very nervous. Very nervous. Let's just say the name Taiwan. Could the fall of the Soviet Union be the answer to this consecration? All right? Well, it might have been evidence of something, but it doesn't seem to really speak to a complete answer. We remember in 1989, you know, that the Berlin Wall was brought down, and so that was only a few years, 5 years after this consecration. So it would seem as if like something happened, right? But we know the fact that Russia was not converted. It has not yet been converted. And so what about this question of, will she spread her airs throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions of the church? Well, there was the Korean War. That had communism as a part of it. The Vietnam communist takeover. China, Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. Cambodia. Castro's Cuba, modern-day Venezuela. I mean, these are just to name a few. Actually, if you look at where socialism and communism has been experimented on throughout the world, it's like a list of about 80 countries or something. The workers of the world did not unite, but fought each other. Okay? With World War I being a failure, this slide is out of sorts. I don't know how this happened. We have spent so much time. Chris, can you go back? All right, keep going. Okay, so let me explain what I'm trying to figure out here. The reality was that communism had a certain sort of approach to what it was going to happen, what was supposed to happen. And that is that, according to Marxist theory, in a time of a revolution, the workers should unite, and they should seek to overthrow, the proletariat, he called it, to overthrow the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, the landowners, and so forth and so on. That didn't happen in World War I, nor did it happen in World War II. But after World War I, there were some efforts around Europe, or in particular, to try to, foment that kind of revolution and make things happen. And so there were several revolutions without any real teeth, okay? And this all happens again. This is after 1917, and when they were speaking about the errors of Russia, nobody could understand it because Russia was not yet communist, right? There was still a Tsar Nicholas II in Russia. There was nothing of this threatening, really, about Russia at the time these things happen. So World War I happens, finishes up, and then in post-Fatima, you see the Bolshevik Revolution takes place by the end of the year. And they, again, try to foment these other revolutions as well. There's the Soviet Republic of Bavaria, it only goes 6 months. There was an uprising in Berlin in 1919. On Hungary, there was 133 days in 1919. So what went wrong? Well, after some time of reflecting on Marxist theory, a couple of different individuals, both Marxists themselves, working independently, developed the same idea, basically, of what we call cultural Marxism, or in some places they call it neo-Marxism. Okay? Next. So, political communism can be seen overtly in its efforts to overturn a nation by means of a violent revolution overturn. But cultural Marxism, or neo-Marxism, is much more clandestine and really sinister. In Marxist theory, it states that when a revolution occurs, these workers should unite and overthrow governments. But as I said, this didn't happen. The workers fought each for his own country and not for other countries or other workers. So therefore, Lukács and Gramsci saw the need to destroy the civilization and Christianity because these were the bulwarks against the true workers' plight, the workers' true plight, and that communism was meant to fix, right? So Lukács clearly says that the Western civilization itself is the enemy. So there needs to be a worldwide overturning of values, and this can't take place without the annihilation of existing values on which it's founded, and then followed by a creation of new set of values. And here we see example of dialectics developed in the philosophy of Georg W.F. Hegel, adopted by Karl Marx. Right? And we learn by a transformative process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And so a thesis is an assertable proposition. An antithesis is an equally assertable and apparently contradictory proposition. And then there's a synthesis. Right, now, Hegel doesn't have anything to do with Marxism himself, right, necessarily. He's simply a philosopher from whom Marx borrows this epistemology, basically, in this process. Okay, and the third thing, the synthesis, is where the contradiction between the two propositions is resolved on a higher level of truth, or so-called higher level of truth, right? So we learn to differentiate one thing from another, and one thing moves to another phase of knowledge, typified like in language acquisition. So you're going to teach a little child the word ball, right? And then the child picks up a doll and says ball, but then you contradict that and you say, no, doll. And they learn little by little by proposition and counter proposition, the distinction between, a doll and a ball, a car and a truck, et cetera, et cetera. And Okay, next. For Hegel, this defined how history and science work as well. So science, let's say, for example, the earth is the center of the universe, right? Remember, that was the belief once upon a time. Antithesis, is this provable to be true? And so then they test it with the scientific method, and through all of that, you come to another proposition, the synthesis. No, the sun is at the center of the solar system, which is in one part of our galaxy, right? So all of that so things grow and develop through this process. Marx then used this concept in what's called dialectical materialism, in which humanity, so listen, this is his understanding, humanity would inevitably evolve into a classless society of equity and justice for all. Okay, that's the goal, right, for communism. We are going to evolve into this utopia, a classless society. Right? So Lukács and Gramsci applied it to things less tangible than, these things that Marx was a materialistic approach. These were going to apply it to the culture. All right? So the thesis, what we have is the old culture and the old civilization. The antithesis, we're going to contrapose it by shaming the old ways, right? And then we'll create a new way, the socialist way, the communist way. I'm using those two terms interchangeably. More technical historians will differentiate for you, but for our concerns, they're pretty much the same. In that above-mentioned Soviet Republic of Hungary of 1919, George Lukács had his chance. He got elected into part of the government or whatever, and he immediately introduced sex education in public schools with the intention of changing society's sexual mores. He gave out graphically explicit materials encouraging free love and the rejection of Christian values. Does that sound familiar at all? That was 1919. Gramsci introduces the idea of the long march to the institutions. The culture is the new battleground, and all cultural barriers must be reconfigured. Family, churches, arts, cinema, entertainment, theater, literature, science, schools. Here's one, seminaries, right? They're going to go after everything. This long march to the institutions will create an anti-Christian culture which will destroy Christian beliefs in the vast majority of the people. This would eventually create an openness in the people to Marxism, really. I say cultural Marxism there, that's really to Marxism. You'll see that kind of phrase reiterated a couple more times. All right, does that sound like that's happened at all? Right, okay. Lukács played an important part in forming the Frankfurt School, all right? So, again, these are offspring, shall we say, from the Bolshevik Revolution, all right? I'm not showing all the connectivity there, but it's there, okay? So all of these people are coming from the same frame of mind, and you'll see where this goes. So the Frankfurt School has a goal to turn Marxism from economic terms to cultural terms, all right? So they're adopting this approach from Lukács and Gramsci. These members included people like Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, and 15, 20 others. All of these Marxists were also Jews, so when Hitler comes to power, they flee to New York City and establish themselves there with the help of Columbia University. Instead of destroying Germany, they focus on the United States. Aren't we lucky? So Herbert Marcuse, one can rightly speak of a cultural revolution since the protest is established against the whole institution, including the morality of existing society. The traditional idea of revolution is ended. What we must undertake is a type of diffuse and dispersed disintegration of the system. All right? It's very deliberate. This is my point tonight in great part. This is very deliberate what has happened. It is not by accident. All right, as I said in my little flyer that I sent out, you'll learn why it is that your kids don't come to church, in part, okay? Because they have been attacking from, Hollywood to the media to what's in the schools and everything, focusing on an ever more materialist, is very important, materialist point of view, humanist, worldly point of view, not a supernatural divine revelation that says God created the world in 6 days and on the seventh, all the rest, none of that. No, we're going to live with evolution and so forth and so on. All these things, this is where we're going to focus our attention. 1950s, U.S. working class was moving into the middle class, the bourgeoisie, and who would lead the way? A coalition of blacks, feminists, sexual libertarians, free love people, students, etc. This was their front line, right? They wanted to send in the front line towards these institutions. This cultural Marxism does not carry its own name. It's seen in what has been deemed as multiculturalism, or nowadays political correctness, right? So they don't use that term, cultural Marxism. That would be too loaded, right? So they begin to develop amongst the Frankfurt School this critical theory, all right? And so they marry two things, Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx, in which from these point of views, all the cultural norms are criticized and destroyed. All those people, for example, who are successful in business, they're oppressors. All who are not are victims. Men and women, are there any differences? Well, yeah, let's exploit those. We'll call men male chauvinist pigs. What about fathers? Yeah, they're just patriarchal tyrants, bishops and priests among them, right? Here's a guy of the Frankfurt School, Willie Munsenberg. He founded, he's another one of these founders who noted that the failure of the urban proletariat, again, the working class, to mount successful revolutions in economically advanced countries was predicted by Marx. So, to counter that failure, it was necessary to organize the intellectuals and use them to make Western civilization stink. Only then, after they have corrupted all its values and made life impossible, can we impose the dictatorship of the proletariat. All right? Do you feel like people are ashamed of their past? That people are ashamed of our past, right? Now, we're all humans, right? So we're all sinners, right? But in this ideology, which is different than a theology, the redemption, of course, is not through Jesus Christ. The redemption is through Karl Marx and communism, right? That's what you're going to see here. We're ashamed of our past. Christianity is responsible for all the failures, racism, slavery, and everything. So we keep bringing all of the errors up of the past up, and we shame the culture in order to subdue it, all right? Now, again, I'm not advocating for slavery, and I'm not advocating at all for racism. I'm just saying these things are all being brought up on purpose to heap coals of shame upon us all and to open the doors to a new system and to a new way. So all those people out there in the streets who are advocating for certain things and certain changes that they want, nowadays, do they know all of this stuff? I don't think so. They're just, I've felt injustice in my life. I've felt, oppression, and therefore I want to act for justice's sake, and so I'm going to go out and I'm going to do this and do that and do the other thing, right? We're going to make change. But as we will see, as things progress, it doesn't usually get better, because we've all seen the Marxist world that has been offered and the Marxist solution. And it's never ended well, right? So the proletariat, nevertheless, here is not the proletariat anymore. Okay, so that working class kind of group that was being defended and trying to be uplifted in the ideology of Karl Marx, shifts in this cultural Marxism. The proletariat is now any number of identity groups, even if they are well off, The proletariat of today is any one of a number of collective groups that differ from the predominant culture of the past. This is a book written recently by Rod Dreher. In classic Marxism, he says, the bourgeoisie are the oppressor and the proletariat are the oppressed. In the cult of social justice, the oppressors are generally white, male, heterosexual, and Christian. Next. Oh, back up. Next. I'm sorry. So the oppressed are racial minorities, women, sexual minorities, and religious minorities. Curiously, he goes on to say, the poor are relatively low on the hierarchy of oppression. For example, a white Pentecostal man living on disability in a trailer park is an oppressor. A black lesbian Ivy League professor is oppressed. Right? And he's not just, those aren't just, what do you call those? That's not an ethereal thing. That's come out in papers. Those types of articles are out there in the papers where a Harvard-type professor is saying, how awful it is. And it's like, wait, what happened to the poor and where everything has shifted? You see what I mean? The goalposts shift. And so the proletariat of the past is not the proletariat, as it were, today. In cultural Marxism, you shift along the lines so as to create the instability that you want. And we'll see more of that when we get to Bella Dodd and how she explains things. So justice is not a matter of working out what is rightly due to an individual per se, but what is due to an individual as the bearer of a group identity. That is, these new identity groups. In all of this, we see the destruction of the sovereignty of the individual as it is replaced by the value of the collective. So what does all of this have to do with the church? It just goes to the depths, it just goes to show the depths to which communist thought has penetrated and executed its anti-gospel, even into the American mainstream culture, and from this infiltration, right? So through the culture, it's getting to the church, and we'll see a little bit more about that. The Winona Project. This was U.S. intelligent decryption and translation of about 3,000 messages of the Soviet Union over 37 years. They uncovered various things, this knowledge of the Cambridge Five, which was a group of communist infiltrators in the United Kingdom, as well as things that were going on here. A book then called The Winona Secrets, published in the year 2000 by Romerstein and Bryndell, shows the Winona Project and so much of what it uncovered. This understanding, this thing called the outstretched hand, was the communist outreach to the church. Okay, so Earl Browder was the Communist Party USA leader, and he addressed a message to Catholics blithely claiming that communists and Catholics had the same goals, adding piously, "We extend the hand of brotherly cooperation to the great mass of democratic Catholics." All right, they're extending a hand to the Catholics, saying, we can work together, right? The real reason for the outstretched hand was explained. This is I think Soviet term, right? The outstretched hand is a communist plot and project. So this was explained by Louis Boudens at a secret meeting of the Central Committee in December 1938. He says, "We can see what this Catholic question means in the building of the Democratic Front when we consider the Catholics in the Democratic Party. We cannot begin to touch the Democratic Party at any point, particularly in the industrial centers and also in its progressive wing, without being confronted with active Catholic leaders." So in other words, in order to infiltrate the Democratic Party, they had to go through the church. So ironically, Boudens eventually leaves the Communist Party and becomes an active Catholic and an anti-communist. After his conversion, he explained to his fellow Catholics how communists use the outstretched hands to infiltrate and manipulate them. Right? So they use whatever is at their disposal to get the means and the goals that they are looking for. And it doesn't matter who's in the way, they're going to go for it. I'm going to take just 5 minutes here, slow down, and we'll pick up now with several other people who can tell us a little bit more. This is Manning Johnson. He's actually was a local guy down the road in Buffalo. But I'll just give me a second just to take my breath. So it may not be as professional. I hope it's not too disjointed. Are you able to follow it? Yes. Any questions so far? Okay. Okay, so Manning Johnson, I said he was... okay. Okay, so the question is about racism and being manipulated. So the idea is, as we heard Willie Munsenberg, he said we need to teach, we need to make them feel that their culture stinks, right? So they take up all your past errors, right? So in Christianity, you go to confession, right? And you believe that you have been forgiven, and Jesus forgets your past. Now, you don't forget your past, and the person you've hurt maybe doesn't forget your past and all that, but you have a place to go where you can grow and so forth. In this system, they keep bringing up all the errors of our past to continually to heap shame so that the people in the culture will no longer want to espouse the values of that culture, that old culture, and they're ready to embrace a new system and a new way. You see what I mean? Right. There's no, in a sense, there's no forgiveness for the past. We're just going to keep heaping it upon you till you so hate it that you'll want something new. So for you and I are of a certain age, right, we're still holding to that past. But the younger and younger generations are less adhered to the culture that we grew up with. True? But does the church raise people racist? We have African priests in our diocese. We have Latin American priests. We have a church filled. And it's not to say that there's no racists, but it's not. There's a whole branch of our church. There's cardinals who are racist. There are cardinals who are African. Our church embraces every continent and every group and every people. Are some people, going to be racist? In every group, you're always going to have people who are guilty of some kind of thing or another, right? But to say that we're raising a people to try to do things. Now, we have had errors in the past, and we have sinners. The church grasps, Lumen Gentium from the Second Vatican Council, the church grasps sinners and pulls them to her breast, it says. That is, we are all sinners, but we strive, we seek pardon, and we seek forgiveness, and we seek to forgive, right? But when this energy and this effort is continually placed before the people to only remember your sins, how many of us want to walk into a door every day where somebody's going to tell us all the sins of our past life? We don't want to walk in that door, right? If I walk in and I say, but yesterday I asked you to forgive me and you forgave me, and today I'm asking you for pardon again. So tomorrow, do I have to keep repeating this cycle? Do I have to keep repeating this cycle? That is to say that there is a purpose. And I'm not saying that everybody who is... You've heard me say not everybody is guilt-free. Let me say it this way. But also, people are adopting this frame of mind without realizing what they're doing, right? I mean, I know that there's social injustice. I'm not trying to say there's no social injustice. That's not what I'm trying to say. But the church has always, we have had, when the Irish came to the United States, were they poor or were they rich, generally speaking? They were poor. When the Italians came to the United States, generally poor, generally rich. Polish, when they came to the United States, generally poor, generally rich. So many people came to the United States poor, right? The church educated them and raised them up, okay? Unfortunately, we've lost that school system in great part that we once had that brought so many people up out of poverty, educated them, brought them up into the middle class, and they were able to do well and to fare well. And And for decades, even after some of the schools started to close down, there were people of color in our school systems that we were continuing to educate and try to do the same thing, even though they weren't Catholic, right? Does that mean no priests ever abused? No, we know priests did bad things. Sisters did bad things. Lay people did bad things. Everybody is faulty and frail. But there are a lot of good things that we've been doing over the years, but those don't get brought up. There is a particular deliberate effort to cast aspersions and everything that we have done wrong, and not to illuminate all the outreach, all the charity, all of the soup kitchens, all of the different things that have been happening over the years. Those don't make the front pages. You know, 60 people fed today from Assumption Parish, Sunday night dinners. Doesn't make the top of the fold, as they call it, right? Once in a great while, you'll see that. But for some crazy reason, also, humanity has a kind of a propensity for the bad. Like, it's so much more interesting to see, another priest got caught and is sent up the river or something like that. For whatever reason, we glom on to that kind of bad news, okay? Manning Johnson served as a district agitation propaganda director for Buffalo, New York from 1932 to 34, and he was district organizer for that area as well. Next slide. So this is from the 7th report on the House Committee on Un-American Activities, New York City, Area 53. You can find these things on the Internet Archive. So the outstretched hand was the new United Front policy, he said, of the Communist International. So the Communist International was this sort of international organization of trying to spread communism throughout the world. And it was the extension of the hand of friendship and cooperation to the church, while in the other hand, he says, holding a dagger to drive through the heart of the church. In other words, it was a ruse whereby they could get the churches involved in United Front activities with the communists so that the communists could bring to the religious element in America their anti-religious program. In other words, to educate the masses in the revolutionary program and policy of the Communist Party to prepare them ideologically and organizationally for the overthrow of the government of the United States. All right? So a very clear and deliberate plan. Even the Communist Party archives in Moscow have shown the existence of Operation Outstretched Hand and define its goals, according to Romerstein in the book. So now this is Bella Dodd. She wrote this book, School of Darkness, which is a biography of hers. And she was born in Italy and raised by foster parents for 5 or 6 years, and then she came very young to the United States. Was raised loosely Catholic, went to public schools, very bright, graduated from Hunter College, then a master's at Columbia, and finally at NYU, she got a doctorate in jurisprudence. She says that in the 1930s, the family had grown up, and I had the opportunity to go to Europe. I visited Italy and Germany. I was appalled by the growth of fascism in Italy and more distressed over what was happening in Germany. On the campus in Germany, I saw young men fighting with fists, guns, rocks, and so forth and so on. I was an easy person to approach. Nobody else approached me at that time. This is after she comes back to America. But then the communists were on my doorstep with the question, "We hear you are an anti-fascist. Will you join the committee?" I was the kind of person who felt if you believed in something strongly, you had to act. I was an anti-fascist. They asked me to join a committee. I did. I did not know how they were functioning. So she continued to work with the Communist Party from 1932 to 1943 in various capacities, but not known as a communist, not publicly. The Communist Party was emphatic that professional people engaged in public service who had public jobs were not to be exposed and were not to be card-carrying members. She became a member of the National Committee from 44 to 48 and remained also on the State Communist Party of New York, 44 to 48. She was expelled from the Communist Party in 1949. what had happened was there was a landlord who had some legal issue, and she had knowledge of the law and so forth. So she mostly was in teaching and in teachers' union work. But she was trying to help this landlady. Well, what's a landlady? Well, that's bourgeoisie, right? That's a landowner that's not the right kind of people, and because she was not proletariat-centered in that exchange, the communists started to give her a hard time, and she got disoriented or alienated, disaffiliated with them, and then they followed her, the FBI followed her. She was really very, very nervous for quite a while. She went on to say, the secret of the communist movement is centralization and organization. You might have 5 delegates to the American Federation of Labor Convention who were communists, but they met in advance, decided what they were going to do in advance, discussed among themselves what they could accomplish at that convention, and they, at least, would be armed and would get something out of that convention when the others might not know what they were driving at. You need to understand it as a communist government rather than party. It's concerned with all matters and parties, economics, social life, especially education, cultural life, morality. Certainly not about an improvement of morality. It will promote abortion and chaos at one moment, then high ideals the next. Again, you have that clashing of things, right? So if they can get people clashing in the midst of a meeting, thesis, antithesis kind of thing, they will do that. Their approach to morality is a question of tactics and not a question of principle. For them, there is only one morality, and that is the support of the communist system. They want to create chaos and animosity, as I was just saying. Children against parents, women against men, blacks against whites, Protestants against Catholics, Christians against Jews, and vice versa. The goal is to paralyze, here it is, the goal is to paralyze the body politic that it is unable to resist communism. So we had the feminist movement, we had race riots, we had Protestants and Catholics where there's pressure regarding birth control, marriage and divorce, women priests. All these things have happened. Children against parents, and they're what I call the all-in-the-family syndrome, all right? So a particular degradation of fathers and family life. So Archie Bunker, as you know, came along on the scene, right? And so before that, you had Father Knows Best, right? Leave It to Beaver, My Three Sons. You had these images of fathers who were kindly, wise, understanding, merciful, compassionate, so forth, but also, you know, strong in their values and so forth. Archie comes along and he embodies every embarrassing thing from the past, you know. He's bigoted, he's chauvinistic, and all of this stuff. And of course, it's a comedy, so it's very easy to absorb. The Latins have a word, I don't know if I can say it, something like res est bellum, you know, laughter is war. Right? So if you, what was a court jester? I think the court jester could get away with certain things with the king, right? He could go in and he could kind of say, if he was crafty and clever enough, he could say the kinds of things that nobody else could get away with because he would make everybody laugh, but at the same time, and you know good comedians can do this, they can push those borders, you know, a little bit and you know, question authority and so forth and so on. And so Archie Bunker is that kind of Trojan horse into the culture, and you got, you know, what does he call his son-in-law? Meathead, you know. And so you have this tension against fathers and children, and it's really encapsulating so much, and of course Gloria is a feminist and all this kind of stuff, so it's encapsulating all that's going on in the 1970s in its thing. And then from that point forward, when you look forward, all the sitcoms, really, all the father figures are kind of, they're dolts, all the way up to one of my favorites, I have to admit, everybody loves Raymond, but, you know, Deborah always knows more than Raymond. And so this imagery in the family, like, dads don't know anything, moms know everything, and so forth. And I'm not saying that women don't have wisdom, but it's been this shaming, once again, of the father figure. And going to the point of, well, we don't really need dads. We just go to a sperm bank and have our kids and so forth and so on. So it just extends into so many layers and levels. So regarding Belladad's own indoctrination at college, she spoke of how a literature professor gave her several books about various revolutions. The communists want to, again, destroy patriotism. By the way, St. Thomas Aquinas says that patriotism is a virtue. It's not nationalism, that gets a little bit different, but patriotism, he says it stems from the virtue of piety. To love your country is a good thing. So he says they want to destroy patriotism and make you feel shame for your country. They also destroy the sense of sin. There is no God, right? It's atheistic, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So there's no sin. And if no sin, then how shall we behave? Well, according to what makes us most comfortable, right? What gives us the most return? If it feels good, do it. Remember that? If it feels good, do it. You can commit abortion or commit euthanasia, whatever. Alexander Trachtenberg, an engineer from Yale, at a dinner she was in attendance at, both Democrats and Republicans were present. And he said, this is in the, I think it's 1932 at the latest, if I remember correctly from when this happened. When we get ready to take the United States, he says, we will take her not under the label of communism or socialism. These words are unpleasant to the American people and have been speared too much. We will take the United States under the labels that we have made very lovable, under the labels of liberalism, progressivism, and democracy, but take it we will. There are two phases in life the communists always take over, Belladad goes on. One is control over money, and two is control over words, language. They are fast-taking over all the nice words, all the nice language of the Christian world, and they are giving them new connotations so that when they talk to the world, they hear one thing that is understood by their followers. But to our ears, it sounds like something that we should defend. During the Spanish War, the Communist Party was able to use some of the best talent of the country against the Catholic Church by repeating ancient appeals to prejudice, by insinuating that the Church was indifferent to the poor and against those who wanted only to be free. With regards to the infiltration of the Church, there is a report of a public affidavit witnessed to Alice von Hildebrand and Paul and Janine Leninger. So Alice testifies to the fact that she publicly stated in this speech stated this in a speech in Orange County, California. Also, Brother Joseph Natale, a young novice at St. Vincent's Arch Abbey in Latrobe, Pennsylvania in the 1950s, said she was present in a public lecture in which Belladad discussed the Soviet infiltration of the Catholic Church. Let me step aside because I don't think I put it here in the slideshow. So Belladad had left the Communist Party USA by the 1940s. She felt ashamed for her past, but she didn't know exactly what to do about it. A guy, I'll say a congressman by the name of Christopher McGrath, no relation that I know of, approached her one day and said, would you like to talk to Monsignor Sheen? You know, Bishop Fulton Sheen eventually, right? And she said, well, yes, I guess so, I would. So she is brought to, I think he was down in D.C. at that point, so he brings her down. She takes a train down with certain kind of regret or remorse or whatever, anxiety at least, about going to see this priest. Now, Fulton Sheen was pretty famous even then. He had radio shows before he was on TV in the 50s. He had a radio show from the late 30s, I believe, so he was well known. And she goes to see him. She has a very good experience. And over the next year or two, she gets brought into the church, kind of a revert into the church and fully engages. She said at one point there, well, I think I should go into a nunnery or something and do my penance. And he said, no, I don't want you to do that. I want you to go around the country and tell people what you've done and how all of this works. And so that was you can find her, that's what she does. You can find her on her talks on YouTube, some of the recordings. Brother Joseph goes on to say, I listened to that woman for 4 hours and she had my hair standing on end. Everything she said has been fulfilled to the letter. Belladad said that of all the world's religions, the Catholic Church was the only one feared by the communists, for it was its only effective opponent. Speaking as an ex-communist, she said, in the 1930s, we put 1,100 men into the priesthood in order to destroy the church from within. In this book by Paul Kengor, he cites that the figure goes as high as 1,200, depending on which witness you hear from. The idea, she said, is for these men to be ordained and then climb the ladder of influence and authority to come to be monsignors and bishops. Back then, she said, right now they are in the highest places and they are working to bring about change in order that the Catholic Church will no longer be effective against communism. She also said these changes would be so drastic that you will not recognize the Catholic Church. So I asked the question, and I'm not trying to say anything about, what's going on in the church. It's been a tough time, but if you were a 1945 Catholic, right? Latin Mass everywhere, and so forth and so on, and then you were a 1995, and you were just translated really from 1945 to 1995, you would not have recognized the church in a certain sense. We've all grown through this sort of slow change, but I'm not trying to say anything bad. I'm just saying it seems to be a very different thing today than it was back then, right? And I'm not saying it was all glorious and wonderful. That's not the point. But you can certainly say there's a big, big difference. She goes on, once these men had become bishops, their influence could be widely spread because bishops beget bishops, and these agents would use their influence to elevate and promote clergymen who are not necessarily dedicated communists, that is, just kind of sympathizers, but not necessarily a part of the party, but who were of a progressive and liberal mentality and whose influence could be counted on to foster a new philosophy and a theology within the ranks of the clergy. Once the clergy were infected, they would pass this infection to the laity. The whole idea was to destroy not the institution of the church, but rather the faith of the people through the promotion of a pseudo-religion, something that resembled Catholicism but was not the real thing. Once the faith was destroyed, then the dismantling of the institution would take place. She explained that there would be a guilt complex introduced in the church. To label the church of the past as being oppressive, authoritarian, full of prejudices, arrogant in claiming to be the sole possessor of truth, and responsible for the divisions of religious bodies throughout the centuries. This would be necessary in order to shame church leaders into an openness to the world and a more flexible attitude toward all other religions and philosophies. The communists would then exploit this openness in order to undermine the church. Mrs. Leninger, this is Janine Leninger, who signed an affidavit testifying to that infiltration of 1,100 or 1,200 seminarians. She confirmed Dodd's statements, and she said she knows of several priests who faithfully taught the Catholic religion until they became bishops or were promoted to other influential posts, and then immediately exhibited hostility to that same faith which they had previously professed. Leninger described these priests as sleepers, a term designated individuals or groups who carry out their espionage function only at a selected time. Before becoming active, the sleeper will refrain from any espionage or subversive functions. According to Catholic philosopher and professor Alice von Hildebrand, she also, I've heard her in a video, testify to that 1,100 seminarians statement. She was a friend of Dodd, and she told her that when she was an active party member, she dealt with no fewer than 4 cardinals within the Vatican who were working for us, i.e. the Communist Party. Okay? That would be like in the 50s or 60s when she would have said that. Okay. Water break. Stepping back to 1933, Pope Pius the 12th. Well, it was before he's Pope Pius the 12th. Okay, he speaks about this suicide. Next slide. And this is just 16 years after Our Lady's apparitions at Fatima. And so the future Pope Pius XII, then Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, Secretary of State to Pope Pius XI, made prophetic remarks in confidence to his friend Count Enrico Pietro Galeazzi. Pacelli stated that Our Lady of Fatima's confidences to Sister Lucia were a warning against the suicide, of destruction of the liturgy, and of others' dangers of altering the faith. Suppose, dear friend, that communism is the most visible among the organs of subversion against the Church and the tradition of divine revelation. Thus, we will witness the invasion of everything that is spiritual: philosophy, science, law, teaching, the arts, the media, literature, theater, and religion. I hear around me innovators who wish to dismantle the sacred chapel, destroy the universal flame of the Church, reject her ornaments, and make her remorseful for her historical past. Well, my dear friend, I am convinced that the Church of Peter must affirm her past, or else she will dig her own grave. A day will come when the civilized world will deny its God, when the Church will doubt as Peter doubted. She will be tempted to believe that man has become God, that his Son is only a symbol, a philosophy like so many others. And in churches, Christians will search for the red lamp where Jesus awaits them, like the sinful woman crying out before the empty tomb, "Where have they taken him?" Now pause right there. Do any of you know about any situation like that? Well, in many churches, they literally took the tabernacle out from the front in the main altar and put it in a back room. Sometimes you had to paint one of those, airport or those hospital. Remember the tape on the hospital floor? Follow the yellow tape or whatever. You had to go find the Blessed Sacrament in some back alleyway in the building or whatever. They would. Sometimes they would take the church and turn it sideways and do this and that. I've heard several of those kind of renovations that have happened and so forth and so on. And here he is saying this in 1933, that people will be like the Mary Magdalene, looking for the Lord. Where have they laid him? So, what have we seen since the time of these prophetic words? Ever-growing doctrinal relativism, maybe there's a hell, maybe there's not. Maybe people go there, maybe they don't. Maybe this is okay, moral relativism. Maybe this is okay, maybe it's not really sure. What's your truth, my truth, your truth, everybody's truth? Liturgical relativism, as it were. Well, we'll just kind of be close to celebrating the sacrament as it's supposed to, but, we don't have to follow all the rules and all the words, An ever-growing secularization. We saw many churches. I was in Caledonia for 6 years, and I found up in the attic a bunch of old pictures. Now, the church that I had, I could have probably put up here a couple of pictures just to show you. When I arrived there were these wrought iron sculptures that were spider webs. So picture wrought iron spider webs with just big circular kinds of lollipop glass, yellow, green, red, blue, sitting in the middle of these spider webs. And it was some kind of art of connectivity between God and us or something like this. It was really, really strange. And I found these pictures up in the attic, and I brought them down and I put them in the hallway of the rectory as we were renovating some things. And there were all these angels, and they were all surrounding things, and there was a beautiful high altar on the back, and all wood carved, and all this kind of stuff. And now there's this kind of strange, usually liturgical art should be something you can grasp without a whole lot of thought. But everybody would walk in there and say, well, what is that? Why are those things there? And what do they mean? And it would be like, I'm not really sure what they mean. It's some kind of abstract sort of art. But this is what we saw far and wide. I brought 2 statues of Mary and Joseph. I found down, apparently they had done something bad and they got grounded, and so they were down in the basement. I'm not sure what they did, but they were being punished. And so I brought them up, And people were like, but Father, we were told you had to throw out all the statues. And I said, can you show me that in a church document? And it's nowhere to be found that you have to throw out all of the liturgical art. It's nowhere. They speak about a noble simplicity. They say there shouldn't be really duplication of images and all this kind of stuff. Of course, as we've closed churches, we take the Blessed Virgin Mary from, Our Lady of Perpetual Help, and we bring over, Our Lady of Good Help or something, Our Lady of Good Counsel. Or we bring all and we end up, stacking them up because it's like, well, we don't want to throw them all away, but now we've closed churches and we've got all these extra statues. But the idea was, maybe decorate churches in a little bit different way, but still, there was nothing that said you had to destroy them all. But I heard stories, oh yeah, they buried them all out in the backyard. They broke them all and buried them out and stuff. I had multiple people tell me these stories in multiple parishes. So, people being very casual with the sacred liturgy and so forth and so on. We had, clown masses and all kinds of things. So we've seen a very great decline in the practice of the faith. We're down in our country to about 30%. I think in 1950, about 75% of all Christians attended Sunday services regularly. But now across the country, we're around 30% and maybe a little bit lower. Decline in the belief in the Catholic faith of the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, right? Just 1/3 of U.S. Catholics agree with their church that the Eucharist is the body and the blood of Christ. Pew Research Center. Grave liturgical irreverence, sometimes even causing the sacraments, including the Eucharistic sacrifice, being ad-libbed by certain priests and who are using the new rites, after the Second Vatican Council. Here's a couple of cases. Another priest, this is a second priest, who finds out that his baptism was not valid. Next slide. Father Bozeman was allegedly baptized, as a child, like all of us, and he's looking at a video of his baptism one day after he's been, quote-unquote, ordained a priest, only to listen to the priest say, or the deacon, whoever it was, say something like, "We baptize you in the name." And that's not the formula that comes from the Bible. The baptism formula is by Jesus. It's by the church where it says, "I baptize you," because the priest or the deacon is a minister on behalf of Christ. It's not the Christian community that baptizes. If you're in an emergency situation and you're going to baptize a person, you don't say "we," you say "I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit," right? So that invalidated, and there's probably any number of things that have invalidated. This guy had to go and get rebaptized, or not rebaptized, baptized again, baptized for the first time validly, and had to be ordained a deacon and a priest again within a few days. And the same thing happened with his father, Matthew Hood. He watched a video of his, maybe this is the one where he watches the video, realizes it's invalid, tells the bishop, and gets baptized, confirmed, etc. on one day, ordained again. Goes through the whole ordination ritual all over again a few days later. So Father Hood's sitting there thinking about all the sacraments he thought he had conferred on his faithful, which were just as invalid as his ordination. "My heart goes out and breaks for those whom I have celebrated Mass. Mass intentions I've offered, the confessions I've heard, and especially the sacraments of anointing of the sick that I've celebrated. My grandmother included among them." Right? So what have we seen that supports this prophecy? Doubts about the exclusivity of salvation through the Catholic Church and the social kingship of Christ. The church teaches, and this is the thing, the church is not an institution like the local high school or the local government, right? What is the difference? The church is the blank of blank, the body of Christ. Right? The church is the presence of Christ on earth. Jesus is the head. We are the body. It's got a visible head here, the vicar of Christ, the Pope standing in for Christ. The body of bishops, the college, we call them the College of Bishops, who teach the faith, who are descended successors to the apostles, and we are all baptized into Christ, right, by the preaching of the word and the celebration of the sacraments, as St. Paul says to the Thessalonians. You have 10,000 guardians in Christ, but it is I who have begotten you, I have born you by the proclamation of the word, right? He preaches the word, as we see at Pentecost and in the successive stories in the Acts of the Apostles, where he is, they're proclaiming the faith, the people receive the faith, they receive the Spirit through the sacraments and so forth, and they're made members of the body. So the church is a living organism. It's the body of Christ. It's not like an organization like 4-H or the Scouts or something, right? It's something very different. And so therefore the church is carrying on the mission of Christ by proclaiming his gospel. Not yours, not mine, his, right? And so that's what we're here for, so that the world may hear this gospel and come to faith. Romans chapter 1. The exclusivity of salvation is the universal validity of the divine law and the eternity and reality of hell. All of these things that we have seen put into question over the past 50 years or so, right? Now, continuing with the errors of Russia. This is Yuri Bezmenov, or his name is, his code name, or what it was, Tomas Schumann. Next slide. And he speaks about ideological subversion. I've got a video, but we won't bring up the video. That's going too far. But so he worked for the Soviet Union's Novosti Press agency. He defected in 1970. He went to Canada. And in a 1983 video, he claimed that the West was slowly being subverted into Marxism by the methods of ideological subversion. So all of what you've been hearing about falls under this category as well, right? So it's a form of warfare that the KGB used against America. The main effort of the KGB was not, listen to this, not conventional intelligence, right? Only some 15% of resources were spent on James Bond-style espionage, while 85% was devoted to a slow process called ideological subversion, or active measures. Methods used by the Marxists: corrupt the young, get them interested in sex, take them away from religion, make them superficial and enfeebled, destroy the people's faith in their national leaders by holding the latter up for contempt, ridicule, and disgrace, cause breakdown of the old moral virtues, honesty, sobriety, self-restraint, faith in the pledged word. So all of these are targets. Main targets were and remain institutions of religious faith, education, media, and culture. The targets also of the hippie movement of that day. Although to all appearances America firmly rejected Soviet communism during the Cold War, Bezmenov correctly observes that there was a massive undercurrent of Marxist-Leninist indoctrination at many, if not most, universities and institutions of learning in the media and artistic communities in the West throughout the 1960s and 70s. This was never challenged or counterbalanced by fundamental American patriotic values. All right, this may have been true then, but we are seeing things a little bit more differently now, I add. This process, he goes on to say, was done by Americans to Americans thanks to a lack of morals. Most of the people educated in the 1960s, intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government. This is 1983 when he's saying this, right? In the government, civil service, mass media, and the education system. He says, you are stuck with them. So here are four, in the video he outlines these four phases of this thing called ideological subversion. Demoralization, all right, break down the moral fabric and have people do what they want. And then destabilize the society. Of course, we had, race riots and other things. You had, again, parents being told, go fly a kite by their kids and all that kind of thing. All that kind of destabilization going on. And then you come to a place of crisis. And he had timelines on all this. Well, it takes 15 to 20 years to do demoralization, and 10 to 15 or whatever. He says for crisis, it says it takes like 6 weeks or some kind of crazy small number, and then normalization. I'm of the opinion that the coronavirus might just be the crisis that is bringing about what we're seeing now. So this crisis is causing an ever-increasing totalitarian, what we're seeing around us, a totalitarian censorship, all kinds of things that are going on in our culture. We're seeing the loss of free speech and so forth and so on. People used to be able to express themselves freely, and now Facebook and Twitter and all these things are doing the bidding, really, of what governments under communism used to do, but now big tech is doing. And, well, people have a different idea. Why can't they share it? Well, no, we're not going to let them share that idea. That doesn't count. So in his 1983 video, he's explaining that the demoralization process in the United States had already been completed to a degree beyond the wildest dreams of the top leadership in the Kremlin. 1983. Now, this is a book called The Devil and Karl Marx by Paul Kengor. And he says that Fulton Sheen cited Marx as having said that communism begins where atheism begins. In the Communist Manifesto, it states that communism abolishes eternal truths, all religion, and all morality. Reagan called it that religion of theirs, which is Marxism and Leninism. He also said that they bow to the nativity, according to Marx and Lenin, a system in which Karl Marx is hailed as the Messiah. Lenin is very clear. Marxism is materialism. As such, it is relentlessly hostile to religion. We must combat religion. That is the ABC of all materialism. We must know how to combat that religion, he says. We must explain the source of faith and religion in a materialist way. It must be linked up with the concrete practice of the class movement, which aims at eliminating the social roots of religion. All right? So, that is the end game, all right? That's Lenin in his own words. And that is really the end game of all that cultural Marxism and everything that we went through, is the church is really the thing that has the target on it, all right? The crosshairs are on the church. Why? Because the church is this bulwark of the Western civilization. The church which produced the university system, right? The church that produced so much of Western science and knowledge. The church that, you know, in as much as there have been problems all throughout the years, if you study the history of the church, there are problems in every era. Prince archbishops that, you know, kind of had their own diocese that ruled them as, you know, really almost secular leaders and so forth. The church has had issues all throughout its history, there's no doubt. But at the same time, it has lasted all through the years to try to stand for the gospel message. Weak as we are, imperfect as we are, what we stand for is not ourselves and our own errors and our own weaknesses. What we stand for is Jesus Christ, His gospel, His saving message, His suffering, His death, His resurrection. But all of that has been put in question. All of that is being shamed. All of that is being reduced to just the sins of the past and not all of the saints and their works of charity. You know? The Benedictines and the good work that they've done in their universities and so forth. The Franciscans and their service to the poor. St. Vincent de Paul and the St. Vincent de Paul Society. The Sisters of Charity, the Daughters of Charity of Missionaries of Charity of Mother Teresa, and so forth. All that is getting buried in the shame of our past. Our Lady said that lasting peace could only come about if certain conditions were met. One of them, as we have already seen, was prayer, especially the Rosary. Her request for prayer for world peace, that's an error, I don't know. Her request for world peace is an important question for us to consider. Why are our prayers needed? We remember, this comes from a book by Father Andrew Apostoli. He says, remember Augustine's words, God made us without us, but he will not save us without us. We must do our part. We must choose to offer our prayers and sacrifices for the gift of peace in the world. In some way, God has made himself dependent on our prayers and sacrifices. Strictly speaking, he doesn't need them, but he wants them. Like St. Padre Pio said of his sufferings in regard to the salvation of souls. Jesus wants my sufferings. Jesus needs my sufferings. The same is true of our prayers and sacrifices. The children remained kneeling for a few moments in the marvelous light that enveloped them. Then Our Lady made another request of them. Pray the Rosary every day to obtain peace for the world and the end of the war. So indeed, Our Lady's request that they daily pray the Rosary for peace was the only request she repeated in all 6 of her apparitions to the 3 visionaries. How powerful this prayer must be if it can obtain peace for the world. We too need to put into practice Our Lady's request to pray the Rosary daily for peace in our time and an end to the culture of death so prevalent today, he goes on to say. Mary asked the children, sacrifice yourselves for sinners and say many times, especially whenever you make any sacrifice, O Jesus, it is for love of you, for the conversion of sinners, and in reparation for the sins committed against the Immaculate Heart of Mary. The children, just being, 7, 9, and 10 years old at the time of the apparition, went on for, the 2 youngest only lived for a couple more years, really. Francisco died first, and then Jacinta not long after him. And they would go all day in the heat of the Portuguese summer without drinking water. They would give their sandwiches to the poor and the needy and so forth. They really sacrificed themselves tremendously. I think Francisco tied a tight rope around his waist and walked around in discomfort and things like this. So they really did suffer and offer sacrifices. The Angel of Portugal in 1916 that appeared to them 3 times before the Blessed Virgin Mary came the following year gave a couple of prayers. Here's one of them. My God, I believe, I adore, I hope, and I love you. I ask pardon of you for those who do not believe, do not adore, do not hope, and do not love you. Later on, Sister Lucia was writing to a relative of hers, and she had the following to say about the power of the Rosary. There's no problem, no matter how difficult it is, whether temporal or above all spiritual, in the personal life of each one of us, of our families, of the families of the world, or the religious communities, or even the life of peoples and nations that cannot be solved by the Rosary. There is no problem, I tell you, no matter how difficult it is, that we cannot resolve by the prayer of the Holy Rosary. With the Holy Rosary, we will save ourselves. We will sanctify ourselves. We will console our Lord and obtain the salvation of many souls. So, what must we do? Repent, right? This is Jesus' message at the beginning of Mark's Gospel. Repent and believe in the Gospel. Repent, go to confession, be converted, pray, fast, read the Bible. Now, Father Jesse Romero, he's a layman, a former cop from Los Angeles, and he's got a radio show. And he talks about the 5 stones of David, so he puts it in a slightly different way, but basically the same message. Rosary, Eucharist, read the Bible daily, fasting and penance, confession. These are the 5 stones. Remember, David picks up 5 smooth stones to slay Goliath. He only uses 1, but so this is the backdrop, the backbone for our faith. Use these things to fight against this evil. This is a spiritual battle, right? This is a spiritual battle. It's not going to be won with regular arms. Padre Pio, with all of this, I know it's heavy duty again. Padre Pio said, pray, hope, and don't worry. Pray, hope, and don't worry. That's hard, but put it to practice the best you can. Pius IX said, give me an army praying the rosary, and I will conquer the world. All right? So that's the end of this presentation, Fatima Forgotten. Okay, so I know, again, that's intense, going back to what I said at the beginning. That's pretty heavy, and it's a lot. My next talk is equally as heavy, equally as intense. I'm thinking I'm going to wait a week before I pick up again. And I got to review it because I'm still seeing tiny little errors. But and I'm skipping over things. I mean, believe me, there's a whole book in this alone, right? So there's so much that's gone on. And I'm not saying all of this to try to scare you. I want to motivate you. I was hoping for a full church, absolutely full church, to say, listen, we need to be on our knees praying. People are worried about, say, CYO, basketball, or their kids' recital, and all these. These are okay things. These are good. Teach your children to pray. Teach your children to pray the rosary. Teach your children to love the faith. Teach your children to learn and know Jesus. I forgot to put it up here again. For those of you parents, say a simple prayer before you pray your rosary, as you pray your rosary, okay? This is, Our Lady gave it, I mentioned that book, Stefano Gobi, Father Stefano Gobi. We'll go more into that in the future. He said when parents were asking about how do they save their children, he said, pray with this rosary, repeat. I bind my children to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. So everybody all together, with this rosary, I bind my children to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. All right? There's a natural authority you have as parents. Now, granted, your grown children don't really owe you obedience. They're fully adults, but they owe you respect. All right? That's the commandment. Honor your mother and father, right? You owe it to your parents, they owe it to you. There's still a natural authority, so you can pray for your children even though they may be grown themselves. With this rosary, I bind my children to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Encourage them to learn to pray the rosary, and encourage them to teach their children to pray the rosary. Okay, it's getting pretty late and pretty intense, and I don't really treasure this, but I believe it has to be said. It's heavy on my heart, and I can't not share it with you so that you can see what's happening around you and try to contest it with the beads, with faith, with the sacraments. Okay? All right. Well, it's on YouTube now, all right? So it's going out.